Pompeii, Italy, August 24th, 79 AD. The hour is somewhere past midnight, when the streets of a Roman city belong to a different kind of citizen than those who walk them in daylight. The Via dell'Abbondanza runs the full length of Pompeii's commercial heart, its basalt paving stones worn smooth by 11,000 pairs of feet, its walls painted in colours that the Mediterranean sun has faded to something almost tender. Bread ovens in the Thermopylae have gone cold for the night. The election notices painted in red and black along the plaster facades. Vote for Gaius Julius Polybius. He will see to it that bread is provided. Stand silent in the torchlight. Fountain water moves through lead pipes beneath the street with a sound like slow breathing. This is a prosperous city, a sophisticated city, a city with paved roads and stepping stones at every intersection, so that pedestrians need not dirty their sandals in the runoff, with public baths that open before dawn and close after dark, with a forum large enough to hold the entire population, with snack bars and brothels and bakeries and workshops producing garum, the fermented fish sauce that the Romans exported to every corner of their world. Pompeii sits at the southern edge of Campania, 23 kilometers south of Naples, at the foot of a mountain that the city's inhabitants know simply as the mountain, because in 79 AD, the word volcano does not yet exist in any language. But tonight, on a street running south from the Via dell'Abbondanza, behind a door that is locked from the inside, and has been locked since before the 10th hour of the evening, something is happening that has nothing to do with commerce, or elections, or the ordinary business of a Roman city conducting its ordinary life. There is light behind that door, not the steady amber of an oil lamp, but something that moves, that shifts, that suggests a flame being carried rather than a flame left to burn undisturbed. There are sounds, not voices in conversation, not the sounds of a household settling into the rhythms of night, but something rhythmic, something that carries beneath it a quality that the night air cannot quite absorb, something that belongs to a register of human activity, that the city's official life, its temples, to Jupiter and Apollo, its imperial cult ceremonies, its respectable public religion, would not recognize and would not sanction. What is happening behind that door has been happening in this city for decades, perhaps longer. It has roots that run deeper than Pompeii itself, back through centuries of human hunger for something that official religion has never fully satisfied. The hunger for direct encounter with the sacred, for secret knowledge, for initiation into mysteries that transform the person who receives them into someone who knows what ordinary citizens do not and cannot know. By the following evening, everyone behind that door will be dead. The mountain will see to that. The eruption that begins the following afternoon, a column of ash and pumice rising 33 kilometers into the sky at the speed of an explosion, will within 18 hours seal this street, this door, this locked room and everything inside it, under 4 meters of volcanic material. The people inside will not escape. Their city will not escape. Nothing in Pompeii will escape. But here is what the mountain's architects of destruction did not account for. In burying Pompeii, Vesuvius did not erase what happened behind that locked door. It preserved it, sealed the evidence in ash and pumice and the slow geological patience of 2,000 years, then returned it to us in fragments, in frescoes, in sealed rooms, in ritual objects, still arranged as their last users left them, in human remains found in positions that the eruption alone cannot explain. What the mountain buried was not merely a Roman city. It was a Roman city conducting religious lives that its public face never acknowledged, practicing rites that its official institutions never sanctioned, hiding within its prosperous, sophisticated, entirely respectable streets, a world of secret cults and mystery initiations and magical practice that runs through every level of its society, from the wealthiest merchant to the most recently freed slave. Tonight, we descend into that buried world, through 5 layers of Pompeii's hidden life, from the city's surface respectability, through its mystery temples and initiation chambers, through the Egyptian shadows that Roman authority feared, through the dark rooms where magic was practiced in the hours when respectable citizens were asleep, to the final night itself, and what the mountain froze forever in the moment of its most ordinary, most secret hour. The door on that southern street is still locked. We are about to open it. To understand what was hidden in Pompeii, you first need to understand what was visible. You need to walk the city as it presented itself to the world, to see its public face in full, before you begin to understand how thoroughly that face concealed what lay behind it. Stand in the Forum on an ordinary morning in 79 AD. The space is enormous, paved in white travertine that reflects the Campanian sun until it becomes difficult to look at directly. On the northern end, the Temple of Jupiter dominates the skyline, its columns rising 12 meters above the Forum floor, the god's painted face visible in the shadows of the pediment. To the east, the Temple of Apollo, older than the Forum itself, its bronze statue of the god still carrying the bow that identifies him. Along the western edge, the administrative buildings of a functioning Roman city, the offices of the duoviary, the magistrates who govern Pompeii under Roman authority, the comitium where elections are held, the macellum where meat and fish are sold under official supervision, temples, markets, law, administration. Everything Rome wanted a provincial city to be. This was Pompeii's official religious life, clean, hierarchical, transactional. You offered sacrifice at the temple of Jupiter, and the god, if satisfied, provided favor. The relationship was a contract. The gods of Rome's state religion were not interested in your interior life, your suffering, your hunger for meaning or consolation or transformation. They were interested in proper form, proper ritual, a proper observance of the procedures that maintained the relationship between the Roman state and the divine order that sanctioned it. Private emotion was irrelevant. Personal experience of the divine was not the point. The point was correct performance, maintained across generations, holding the cosmic arrangement in place through the reliable repetition of established rite. For many Romans, this was sufficient. The state religion provided structure, civic identity, seasonal rhythm, and the reassurance that the relationship between human society and divine power was being properly managed by people trained to manage it. You attended the ceremonies, you observed the festivals, you maintained the small household shrine to the Lares, the ancestral spirits who protected your home, placing offerings of food and wine on ordinary days, and burning incense on the days the calendar designated as sacred. This was enough. This was religion as civic duty, as social practice, as the invisible architecture of a functioning society. But Pompeii was not only Roman. It had been Oscan before it was Roman, Samnite before it was Oscan, and before any of those identities, it had been something older still, a settlement in the shadow of a mountain, at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade routes, where every ship that passed through the Bay of Naples left something behind. By the time Rome absorbed Pompeii into its administrative structure in 89 BC, the city was already layered with cultural sediment that no degree of Romanization would fully dissolve. And with every trading ship that docked at the nearby port of Puteoli, the largest commercial harbour in the western Mediterranean, through which passed goods from Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, North Africa, and every point between, came not only spices and silk and grain and garum, but ideas, practices, and religious traditions that the Roman state regarded with varying degrees of suspicion. By 79 AD, Pompeii's religious landscape was extraordinary in its complexity and density. Researchers cataloguing the city's religious sites have identified, in the excavated 2/3 of the city alone, more than 40 distinct cult locations, ranging from monumental public temples to single-room private shrines, barely large enough for 2 people to stand in. These sites represent not a unified religious community, but a layered, competing, overlapping constellation of traditions that existed in the same city blocks, sometimes in the same buildings, sometimes in rooms separated only by a wall from spaces dedicated to entirely different deities and entirely different ritual systems. The Temple of Isis stands in the theatrical district tucked behind the large theatre, its entrance marked by a high white wall that simultaneously advertises the cult's presence and screens its interior from casual observation. This positioning is not accidental. The Isis cult, imported from Egypt through the trade networks of the Hellenistic world, had been officially tolerated in Pompeii for at least a century before the eruption, tolerated but watched, accepted, but never entirely comfortable within the Roman religious order. In Rome itself, the cult of Isis had been expelled from the city 4 times under Augustus and Tiberius, its temples torn down, its priests punished, its followers driven out, before Caligula finally permitted its official establishment in Rome in the 40th year of the Common Era. The reasons for Roman official suspicion of the Isis cult were specific, and will occupy us fully in a later chapter. For now it is enough to note that the temple's position in Pompeii, visible but screened, public but enclosed, captures precisely the ambiguous status of the tradition it housed. Beside the great Palestra, Pompeii's enormous athletic complex, archaeologists have identified evidence of a collegium, a private religious association, dedicated to practices that draw on at least 3 distinct traditions simultaneously, combining elements of Roman ancestor veneration with Dionysian imagery and Egyptian funerary symbolism in a synthesis that would have made any Orthodox Roman priest deeply uncomfortable. The collegium met in a private house whose triclinium, the formal dining room, shows clear evidence of ritual modification. A raised platform at the room's eastern end, consistent with an altar or focal point for ritual activity. Floor deposits containing ash and animal bone from repeated burning. Wall paintings that mix conventional Roman decorative schemes with symbolic imagery, drawn from mystery cult iconography. This mixing, this layering, this refusal of religious categories to stay separate and distinct is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Pompeii's religious life. The city's inhabitants did not practice religion the way modern people tend to think about religious practice, as a membership in a single institution with a defined creed and a clear boundary between insider and outsider. A Pompeian merchant might maintain an orthodox household shrine to the Roman Lares, while also holding initiation into the Dionysian mysteries, while also making regular deposits at the Isis temple, while also consulting a specialist in magical practice, when a business rival needed to be neutralized, or an erotic attachment needed to be secured, or a legal opponent needed to be silenced. These were not contradictions. They were layers. Each tradition offered something specific that the others did not, and the Pompeian religious consumer assembled the combination that addressed the particular needs of their particular life. The evidence for this layering is written on the city's walls, literally. Pompeii's approximately 11,000 surviving inscriptions constitute the largest corpus of informal Latin writing from the ancient world, and within this extraordinary archive, researchers have identified recurring patterns of language that point toward cult membership, ritual participation, and initiation experience across the city's social spectrum. Certain phrases recur in contexts that suggest they carry coded meaning, references to being one who knows, to having seen, to carrying what cannot be named, to belonging to the number of those who have passed through. These phrases appear in commercial graffiti alongside advertisements for gladiatorial games, in personal messages scratched by lovers on walls near the forum, in informal election recommendations painted by supporters of local candidates. They are woven into the texture of ordinary Pompeian communication so thoroughly that they are easy to miss unless you are looking for them. But once you see them, they are everywhere. The lararium evidence deserves particular attention because it reaches into every household in the city, from the grandest atrium house in the Regio 6 to the single-room rental accommodation, above a thermopolium on a back street in the Regio 1. The lararium, the household shrine, was a fixture of Roman domestic religious practice, a niche or small aedicula in the atrium or kitchen or garden, where the family's protective spirits were honoured with daily offerings. In a conventionally Roman household, the lararium would show the lares as dancing figures in short tunics, flanking the genius, the generative spirit of the paterfamilias, with a serpent below representing the earth's protective power. This is the orthodox form. Pompeii has many of them, but it also has something else. Across the excavated city, researchers have documented lararia that deviate from the orthodox form in ways ranging from slight to radical. A lararium in a foolery on the Via dell'Abbondanza shows the standard lares flanking not the genius of the household head, but a figure identifiable by attributes as Dionysus Bacchus, holding the thyrsus, the pinecone-tipped staff of the god's cult, surrounded by the ivy and vine imagery of Dionysian worship. A lararium in a bakery in the Regia 7 incorporates an image of Isis, with her characteristic headdress alongside the Roman lares, the two traditions coexisting in the same sacred space, without apparent tension. A lararium in a wealthy house in the Regio 6 has been identified by researchers as showing ritual objects associated specifically with mystery cult initiation. The lychnon, the sacred basket, whose contents were central to Dionysian rite, depicted in a household context, where its presence can only mean that the household's religious practice extended into initiation territory. One lararium in particular stopped excavators when they uncovered it in 1973 in a house in the Regio 1. The niche was larger than standard, taking up the full height of one wall of a small back room that showed no evidence of being used for any domestic purpose. No cooking evidence, no sleeping evidence, no storage. The room appeared to have been used exclusively for religious activity. The lararium itself showed a complex painted scene, a ritual procession moving toward a central figure who stands behind a draped object that the painter has rendered in shadow, in deliberate obscurity, as though depicting something that should not be shown directly. Around the central scene, smaller figures in postures of supplication or ecstatic response. At the bottom of the niche, traces of repeated burning and the mineralized residue of organic offerings. The object at the center of the scene, the draped and shadowed thing that the procession is moving toward, has been the subject of scholarly debate since the discovery. Some researchers identify it as a lychnon of the Dionysian mysteries. Others suggest it represents the chest of Osiris from the Isis myth cycle. A third reading proposes it as an object type associated specifically with chthonic ritual, with rites directed toward underworld powers, that does not correspond to any of the mainstream cult traditions, but belongs to a stratum of magical practice that existed beneath and between the recognized mystery traditions. The house in which this lararium was found had belonged, based on electoral inscription evidence, to a family of freedman origin, former slaves who had earned or been granted their freedom and risen into Pompeii's commercial middle class. Their household shrines spoke a religious language that Rome's official priests would have found deeply uncomfortable, but it was their home, their room, their relationship with whatever lay behind that draped and shadowed object at the center of their private sacred world. This is the city beneath the city, not a separate place, not a hidden underworld accessible only through secret passages, but the same streets, the same houses, the same people who voted in the elections and paid their taxes and maintained the civic obligations of Roman provincial life. The same city conducting beneath its respectable surface a religious life of extraordinary complexity and depth, layered with traditions that official Rome tolerated uneasily or not at all, seeking in private what the state's temples could not provide. Pompeii's secret was not that it harbored hidden religions. Pompeii's secret was how far those hidden religions had penetrated into every level of its life, how thoroughly they had woven themselves into the city's daily fabric, and how much evidence of their practice was preserved, frozen in the moment of the city's destruction, waiting in sealed rooms and painted walls and ritual deposits for excavators, who would sometimes know exactly what they were looking at, and would sometimes choose, very deliberately, not to record it. The deeper we go into this city, the clearer that choice becomes. And the clearer it becomes that some of what was practiced in Pompeii's locked rooms and private shrines went significantly further than anything we have discussed so far. The Villa of the Mysteries stands 1 mile outside the city walls. It is time to walk there. The road from Pompeii's Herculaneum Gate runs northwest through vineyards and market gardens, past the city's necropolis, where the tombs of wealthy Pompeians line the road in the Roman fashion, their facades visible to every traveller, entering and leaving the city, their inscriptions advertising the virtues of the dead to anyone who passed. It is a road of ordinary Mediterranean commerce, dusty in summer, muddy in the rainy season, travelled daily by carts carrying wine amphorae and agricultural produce toward the city's markets. 1 mile from the gate, the road passes a property that presents to the outside world a face of complete agricultural respectability. A working estate, vineyards on the southern slope, storage buildings, a pressing room for the grape harvest, the kind of property that existed by the hundreds across Campania, producing the wine that Pompeii exported across the Roman world. Nothing about its exterior announces what is inside. Nothing about its position on a commercial road suggests that within its walls stands one of the most extraordinary and most debated rooms in classical archaeology. The Villa of the Mysteries, 60 rooms, a structure that has grown and been modified over 2 centuries of occupation, its original Hellenistic core expanded and remodeled until by the 1st century of the Common Era, it combines the functions of productive agricultural estate and luxury residence, with a third function that neither of those categories adequately describes. Excavated between 1910 and 1930, it is preserved to a degree that still astonishes researchers who work with Roman domestic architecture. Painted ceilings, mosaic floors, in garden spaces with evidence of the plantings that once grew in them, and at the heart of the residential wing, a room that stopped the excavators when they uncovered it and has not stopped generating scholarly argument in the century since. The triclinium is not a large room by the standards of grand Roman domestic architecture. 15 meters long, 7 meters wide, its floor covered in a geometric mosaic of black and white, its ceiling painted in a scheme that remains largely intact. But it is the walls that matter. On all 4 walls, running at eye level around the entire perimeter of the room, a continuous frieze of painted figures, life-sized, rendered in the deep Pompeian red that has become the color most associated with the city, depicts a sequence of events that has been interpreted, debated, contested, and reinterpreted for over 100 years without producing anything resembling scholarly consensus about every detail of what it shows. What is not in dispute? This is an initiation sequence. The figures move through a narrative that begins with preparation and ends with transformation, depicting stages of a ritual process whose theology is rooted in the Dionysian mystery tradition. What is in dispute? Exactly which stages are depicted, exactly what the ritual objects shown represent, exactly who the participants are, and what their precise roles within the cult hierarchy might be. These disputes are not trivial. They go to the heart of what the Dionysian mysteries actually were, what they actually did to the people who underwent them, and how far their practice in a Roman provincial city diverged from anything that Roman religious authority would have been comfortable acknowledging. Begin at the room's eastern wall, where the sequence appears to open. A young woman, probably adolescent, sits in a domestic interior, reading from a scroll. Beside her, a small boy also reads, supervised by a seated older female figure. The scene has the quality of preparation, of study, of learning what is coming before it arrives. Researchers have interpreted the scroll as containing sacred text, the words of the ritual, the theology of the initiation, the knowledge that the initiate must possess before she can proceed. The boy has been variously identified as a cult servant, a divine child, a representation of Dionysus himself in his childhood aspect. What matters is the quality of the scene, serious, focused, domestic in its surface appearance, but charged with the knowledge that what is being studied is not ordinary knowledge, and what is being prepared for is not an ordinary event. Move along the northern wall. The scene shifts. Figures carry ritual objects in procession, a platter of sacred foods, vessels associated with libation, objects draped in cloth that conceals their identity from the uninitiated viewer. A priestess or cult leader figure presides, older, authoritative, overseeing preparations with the calm efficiency of someone who has performed this ritual many times. The objects being carried are the instruments of the ceremony, the material tools through which the theological claims of the mystery are enacted in physical experience. Their careful concealment in the painting, the draping of certain items, the angle at which others are depicted, mirrors the secrecy with which the cult's sacred objects were actually handled. Never shown to those who had not been initiated, never depicted in ways that would allow the uninitiated to fully comprehend what they represented. Then the frieze enters its most significant and most debated passage. At the center of the northern wall, a figure unveils the lenon, the sacred winnowing basket that in Dionysian ritual served as the container for objects so holy they could not be named outside the context of initiation. What the lenon contained is one of antiquity's most carefully preserved secrets. Literary sources hint but never specify. Scholars have proposed various combinations of objects, including a phallus representing the generative power of Dionysus, serpents, ritual implements, botanical materials associated with the god's mythological history. What is certain is that the revelation of the lichnon's contents was a central moment in the initiation ritual, a moment of sacred disclosure, after which the initiate's relationship to the divine was permanently altered. The figure receiving this revelation recoils. It is one of the frieze's most psychologically acute details. The moment of terror at the threshold of sacred knowledge, the instinctive human response to genuine encounter with the numinous. The initiate does not move forward smoothly into enlightenment. She flinches. She turns away. She covers her face with a gesture that reads as overwhelmingly human, or overwhelmingly real, the response of someone confronting something for which no amount of preparatory reading has fully prepared them. This moment of terror before transformation is theologically significant. The Dionysian mysteries did not promise an easy passage into divine knowledge. They promised a shattering one. What follows has generated more scholarly controversy than any other section of the frieze. A winged female figure, divine, supernatural, occupying a different register of reality from the human figures around her, raises what appears to be a flagellum, a ritual whip, and strikes. The kneeling figure before her turns away, buries her face in the lap of another woman who holds her and receives the blow. The ritual flagellation depicted here has been interpreted by some scholars as symbolic, a representation of the suffering that precedes spiritual transformation, the pain of the death that in mystery theology the initiate must undergo before they can be reborn. Other scholars, drawing on literary evidence about Dionysian initiation practice across the Greek and Roman world, have argued that the scourging was physical, that initiates were actually beaten as part of the ritual, that the pain was real, and its purpose was the dissolution of ordinary consciousness that would allow the experience of the divine to penetrate. The theology behind this violence is specific and coherent. Dionysus is the god who was himself torn apart, dismembered by the Titans in the myth cycle that underlies the mystery tradition, and reassembled, reborn, transformed. His mysteries promised initiates participation in that death and resurrection, an experiential understanding of what it meant to be destroyed and reconstituted as something more than what you had been before. The suffering in the ritual was not incidental or punitive. It was sacramental. It was the mechanism through which the initiate was made capable of receiving what the revelation of the Lignon offered. After the scourging, the frieze shifts again. The figure who was kneeling, who turned away, who received the blow, rises. She is robed differently now. She moves with a quality the painter has captured in posture and gesture that reads unmistakably as changed, as someone who has passed through something and emerged on the other side of it as a different version of themselves. A dancing figure beside her, ecstatic, arms raised, or head thrown back, embodies the joyful dissolution of the self that the mysteries theology located on the far side of suffering. And presiding over this transformed scene, reclining in divine ease, Dionysus himself, accompanied by Ariadne, his divine consort, witnessing the completion of the initiation he authored. The final panel returns to the figure who began the sequence, but she is no longer the girl studying a scroll. She sits attended by servants preparing her as a bride. This bridal imagery has generated its own interpretive controversy. Some researchers read the entire frieze as a depiction of marriage preparation, the mystery initiation, serving as a component of rites accompanying a Pompeian woman's transition from maidenhood to marriage. Others see the bridal imagery as metaphorical, the initiate as bride of Dionysus, the completion of initiation as a sacred marriage to the god whose mysteries she has survived. The two readings are not mutually exclusive. Mystery cult initiation in the Roman world frequently attached itself to life transition moments, and the marriage of an initiate was precisely the kind of threshold moment that the mystery tradition was designed to consecrate. Who was being initiated at the Villa of the Mysteries? The evidence of the frieze combined with the physical evidence of the building suggests an answer that would have troubled Roman authority considerably. The central figure is a woman. The presiding figures throughout the sequence are women. The cult leadership, implied by the frieze, is female. This is not incidental. The Dionysian mysteries in their Roman context specifically offered women access to religious authority and spiritual experience that Roman state religion systematically denied them. Women could not hold official priesthoods in the Roman civic religious system, could not perform the sacrifices that maintained the relationship between the state and the gods, could not occupy the administrative positions through which official religious practice was managed. In the mystery cult, they could be leaders, initiators, keepers of sacred knowledge, authorities over ritual processes that transformed other human beings. Rome had found this threatening enough in 186 BC to attempt the suppression of Bacchic cult practice throughout Italy with the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, the Senate's decree against the Bacchanalia. The historian Livy's account of this suppression describes the Senate's charges against the Bacchic cult in terms that reveal exactly what Rome found dangerous about it. Mixed-gender initiations conducted in secret, oaths of loyalty binding initiates to each other across the normal social divisions of Roman society, practices that Livy describes with escalating horror, including claims of sexual transgression and violence, that modern historians generally read as rhetorical exaggeration generated by official panic rather than accurate description of cult practice. What was real in Rome's fear was the social dynamic. The mystery cult created communities of initiated loyalty that did not respect the hierarchies of gender, class, and civic status on which Roman social order depended. The sources report that the Senate's suppression resulted in the execution of an estimated 7,000 people across Italy, making it one of the largest persecutions in Republican Roman history. The Bacchic cult survived regardless. It adapted, went further underground, attached itself to private domestic contexts, exactly the kind of private domestic context that the Villa of the Mysteries represents, where official scrutiny found it harder to reach. Beneath the triclinium floor, accessed through a trapdoor whose existence was noted by excavators in 1922, and whose contents have never been fully published, a small chamber contained a deposit of objects consistent with the storage of ritual implements between ceremonies, fragments of masks of the type used in Dionysian processions, the lower portion of a thyrsus, the cult's characteristic staff, ceramic vessels of specific types associated with ritual wine use rather than ordinary consumption, botanical material that subsequent analysis identified as including seeds and dried plant matter from species that in appropriate preparation produce altered states of consciousness, species that appear in ancient literary references to ritual contexts where the boundary between ordinary perception and divine encounter was being deliberately dissolved. The wine of the Dionysian mysteries was not the wine of the Roman dinner table. It was sacrament, prepared with additions that the sources never specify and the archaeology can only partially reconstruct, designed to facilitate the experiential encounter with the divine that was the theology's central promise. The suffering of the flagellation, the alteration of consciousness through prepared wine, the overwhelming sensory experience of the ritual space. These were not separate elements, but components of a single designed experience, a technology of transformation aimed at producing a specific psychological and spiritual outcome in the person who underwent it. The Villa of the Mysteries was one node in a network. The Dionysian tradition was one thread in Pompeii's religious underground, but it was perhaps the thread most thoroughly preserved by the eruption, most legible to modern analysis, most willing to speak about what it was and what it did to the people who participated in it, what it told them in that room with the red walls and the life-sized figures and the draping cloth over the sacred objects in the linon, was something that Rome's official temples never offered, that suffering had a purpose, that transformation was possible, that the divine was not a transactional relationship managed by priests on behalf of the state, but a direct experience available to the individual human being who was willing to pass through what the initiation required. People came back to that room. The deposits in the chamber beneath the floor speak to repeated ceremony, repeated ritual, repeated use across years of practice. And when the mountain finally spoke, the villa was occupied. People were inside. Whatever they had built their lives around in that space, they were still doing it when the end arrived. We will return to them, but first, we need to walk back through the Herculaneum Gate and turns south, toward the theatrical district, where a white wall screens a temple from the street, and where a former slave rebuilt a goddess's house for reasons that tell us everything about who the mystery tradition served, and why Rome could never fully contain them. The earthquake that struck the Campanian region on the 5th of February, 62 AD, was severe enough to damage nearly every major building in Pompeii. The Temple of Jupiter in the Forum was left so structurally compromised that it was still under repair 17 years later when the eruption ended the city's existence entirely. The Temple of Apollo lost sections of its colonnade. Private houses across the city required rebuilding from the foundations. The damage was comprehensive, expensive, and disruptive in ways that the city's population spent the better part of 2 decades attempting to correct. Of all the temples damaged in the earthquake, only one was fully rebuilt, within a few years of the disaster. Not the Temple of Jupiter, which anchored the city's official civic religion and sat at the center of its political life. Not the Temple of Apollo, one of Pompeii's oldest sacred spaces. The temple that was rebuilt first, most completely, and at the greatest expense was the Temple of Isis, tucked behind the large theater in the city's theatrical district, its white walls screening its interior from the street outside. The man who funded this rebuilding was, officially, a 6-year-old boy named Numerius Papidius Celsinus. The inscription above the temple's entrance records his name as the donor, his age as 6 years, and notes that in recognition of his generosity, the Decurions, Pompeii's town council, admitted him to their number without charge, an honor normally reserved for men of adult standing and substantial social position. Numerius Papidius Celsinus was 6 years old and could not have organized the purchase of a bread roll without adult assistance. The real donor was his father, Numerius Papidius Ampliatus, a freedman, a former slave who had earned or purchased his freedom and risen into Pompeii's commercial class with sufficient wealth to fund the complete reconstruction of a major religious building. Roman law and social convention prevented freedmen from holding positions on the town council or receiving formal civic honors in their own names. So Ampliatus used his son's name, the son having been born free, and in doing so gave his family the civic standing that his own origin denied him. He also rebuilt the temple of the goddess he worshipped. The inscription is one of the most revealing documents in Pompeian archaeology, not for what it says officially, but for what it says in the gap between the child's name and the father's devotion. That a former slave was so committed to the goddess Isis that he spent what must have been a significant portion of his accumulated wealth on her temple, and that Isis, more than any other deity in Pompeii's crowded religious landscape, was the goddess of those whom Roman society had placed at the bottom of its hierarchies, and whom she offered something that Roman social reality explicitly denied them. Walk through the temple's entrance and into the colonnaded portico that surrounds the main sanctuary. The space is intimate by the standards of Roman sacred architecture. This is not the Forum's Temple of Jupiter, and designed to overawe and establish civic authority. This is a space scaled for community, for gathered worshippers, for a congregation with a relationship to its goddess that the imperial cult ceremonies were never designed to create. The columns of the portico were painted in rich colors, their surfaces decorated with sacred imagery, drawn from the Egyptian iconographic tradition that the Isis cult carried westward through its spread across the Mediterranean world. Lotuses, ibises, the hieroglyphic symbols that Roman initiates of the cult may not have been able to read but recognized as the visual language of the sacred tradition they had joined. The main sanctuary stands on a raised podium at the portico's northern end. Inside, the cult statue of Isis occupied a decorated niche, the goddess depicted in the Egyptian-Roman syncretic style that characterized her westward journey. Egyptian in her attributes, the headdress of cow horns and solar disk, the sistrum, the ankh, but rendered in the Hellenistic sculptural tradition that made her intelligible to a Mediterranean audience not raised in the Nile Valley's visual conventions. In the sanctuary's walls, niches held subsidiary cult images and sacred objects. On the walls themselves, paintings documented the myth cycle that gave the cult its theological foundation. The story of Osiris, of his murder by his brother Set, of his dismemberment, of Isis searching the world to recover the scattered pieces of her husband's body, of her reassembly of Osiris, of his resurrection and transformation into the Lord of the Dead and guarantor of the afterlife for those initiated into his wife's mysteries. This myth was the cult's engine. Everything the Isis mystery tradition offered its initiates derived from the story of death, loss, search, recovery, and resurrection. Isis, the divine mother who refused to accept death's finality, who crossed the world in grief and determination to recover what had been taken, who through the power of her love and her magic brought her husband back from death into a transformed existence. This goddess offered her worshippers a personal relationship with the divine that was built on recognizable human emotion, on grief and love and the refusal to abandon those who had been lost. The promise of the Isis mysteries was explicit and extraordinary by the standards of Roman state religion. Initiation guaranteed the initiate a blessed afterlife, not the shadowy, joyless existence in the underworld that conventional Roman and Greek religion offered the dead, a grey continuation of diminished existence without the warmth of life, without the pleasures that made existence worthwhile. The Isis initiate was promised something categorically different: transformation into a condition of divine existence after death, participation in the blessed state of Osiris himself, a personal salvation guaranteed by the goddess who had defeated death on behalf of her husband and would defeat it again on behalf of those who committed themselves to her service. For this promise, initiates paid a significant price. The only detailed account of Isis mystery initiation to survive from antiquity appears in the novel written by Apuleius of Madoros in the 2nd century of the Common Era, a text known as The Golden Ass, or Metamorphoses, whose final books describe the initiation of its narrator Lucius, in terms that most scholars accept as reflecting genuine ritual practice with sufficient accuracy to be used as evidence. What Apuleius describes is a year of preparation before the initiation proper. Dietary restrictions eliminating meat and wine from the initiate's daily life, sexual abstinence, daily ritual bathing, the shaving of the head, the adoption of linen clothing in place of wool, constant attendance at the temple's daily rituals at dawn and in the afternoon, a life reoriented entirely around the demands of the goddess before the central initiation experience was permitted. The initiation itself, Apuleius tells us in language that deliberately obscures its specifics in deference to the oath of secrecy all initiates swore, involved a ritual death and rebirth. The initiate descended to the underworld, encountered the gods of both the upper and lower realms, was dressed at the ceremony's culmination in 12 robes, representing the elements of the cosmos, crowned with a solar crown, and presented to the assembled community of the cult as the sun at midnight, a figure who had passed through death and returned transformed, who now carried within themselves the lived knowledge of what lay beyond ordinary existence. At dawn, they were displayed to worshippers as a divine figure, standing on a wooden platform in the temple, holding a torch, crowned, robed. The community gathered around them in adoration. This was not the distant transactional relationship between worshipper and deity that Roman state religion offered. This was personal transformation. This was the individual human body and consciousness made, temporarily, into an image of the divine. This was religion as lived experience of the sacred, rather than civic obligation, performed on behalf of the state. In the temple's northwestern corner, a small building called the Purgatorium housed the most sacred element of the cult's daily practice, a sunken cistern containing water brought from the Nile, or water ritually identified with the Nile through sacred procedures, used in the purification rites that formed the foundation of the temple's daily liturgy. Twice daily, at dawn and at the second hour of the afternoon, the priests of the Isis temple performed the opening and closing of the sanctuary, rites that Apuleius describes in detail, involving the unveiling of the cult statue, the offering of sacred water, the singing of hymns, in a tradition that combined Greek, Latin, and Egyptian liturgical elements into a ceremonial language that was, in its combination, specific to the westward travelling Isis cult, and recognizable to initiates across the Roman world. When excavators cleared the Purgatorium in 1765, they found the cistern still containing traces of the organic material that centuries of ritual use had deposited. They found in the surrounding spaces assemblages of objects that the temple's priests had not removed when the eruption began, ritual vessels, incense burners, specific implement types associated with the daily liturgy, and in a sealed niche in the Purgatorium's inner wall, a collection of objects that the excavation records describe with a brevity suggesting the recorders were uncertain what they were looking at. These objects included items that belonged to no standard Isis cult assemblage, documented elsewhere in the Roman world. Small figurines in materials and postures that researchers working with the find in later centuries have associated with operative magical practice. Figures in binding positions, figures pierced with small metal pins, figures whose construction requires the kind of technical knowledge of magical procedure that belongs to a specialist rather than an ordinary worshipper, botanical material including dried plant matter of species that appear in ancient magical papyri as ingredients in ritual procedures directed towards specific practical outcomes, the binding of an enemy, the compulsion of a desired person, the protection of a household from malevolent forces, a set of inscribed lead strips of the type associated with curse practice. The boundary between religious devotion and magical practice in the ancient world was not the sharp line that later categories of thought impose on it retrospectively. For the priests and advanced initiates of the Isis cult, the goddess was simultaneously the object of devotion, the guarantor of afterlife salvation, and the source of magical power, a practitioner of magic herself in the myth tradition. The woman who had used her magical knowledge to reassemble her dismembered husband, to breathe life back into his reconstructed body, to conceive and protect the divine child. Horus, access to Isis, was access to her power, and her power was operative in the world in ways that included what we would call magical intervention in ordinary human affairs. Rome's specific fear of the Isis cult crystallized around an incident in the 19th year of the Common Era that the historian Tacitus records in his annals with a combination of outrage and prurient fascination that tells us as much about Roman anxieties as about the incident itself. A Roman noblewoman named Paulina, devoted to the Isis cult, was deceived into spending a night in the Isis temple in Rome by a man who desired her and arranged through corrupt priests to impersonate the god Anubis, with whom Paulina believed she was experiencing a sacred encounter. When the deception was discovered, the Emperor Tiberius responded with a ferocity that went far beyond the punishment of the individuals directly involved. The Isis temple in Rome was demolished, its priests crucified, the cult statue of the goddess thrown into the Tiber. 4,000 initiates were expelled from Rome and sent to Sardinia. What made Tiberius respond with such disproportionate force was not simply outrage at the deception of a noblewoman. It was the confirmation of what Roman authority had always feared about the Isis cult, that behind its legitimate religious facade, its temple its priesthood, its publicly observable liturgy that operated a network of initiatory relationships and secret obligations that could be directed toward ends that had nothing to do with devotion to the goddess. That the privacy of the initiation, the darkness of the inner temple, the secrecy that initiates swore, could be exploited to reach into the lives of Roman citizens in ways that bypassed every conventional social protection. The Pompeian Isis cult operated in the space created by this fear, officially tolerated because Caligula had established the cult in Rome itself, and subsequent emperors had permitted it to continue, but watched, never fully trusted, never fully absorbed into the Roman religious mainstream. The white wall around the temple complex was not merely architectural, it was the visible boundary between what the cult showed the world and what it kept for initiates only. When Vesuvius buried the city, it did not respect that boundary. The wall came down with everything else, and what excavators found in the spaces behind it, in the sealed niches and the purgatorium's hidden compartments, and the sacristy, where the priests kept the objects of the daily liturgy, alongside objects that had no place in any official liturgy, confirmed what Rome had always suspected, that the Isis cult in Pompeii was conducting practices in its interior spaces that its exterior face never disclosed. The priest whose skeleton was found moving through the collapsing city, still carrying the sacred objects he was trying to rescue from the eruption, dying on a street outside the temple with ritual implements in his arms, was not running toward safety. He was running toward the things that mattered most to him, the objects that embodied the practice to which he had given his life, the material evidence of the tradition he served. He did not make it, but the objects he could not save stayed where he left them, and where the eruption sealed them, and where excavators eventually found them. He was not the only one still inside the temple complex when the end came. In the Ecclesiasterion, the small meeting hall where initiates gathered for private ceremonies, the remains of individuals who had sheltered there were found among the ashes. They had not run, or they had run and come back, or they had simply decided that where they were was where they needed to stay. What they were doing when the mountain finally silenced them, we cannot say with certainty, but the room they were in was not a room for ordinary shelter. It was a room for initiates, and the objects found in the ash around them were not the possessions of people who had grabbed what they could on their way to safety. They were the objects of people who, even in the final hours, were doing what the goddess required of them. The Isis temple has told us as much as it is willing to tell, but there is a layer of Pompeii's religious life that exists beneath even the mystery cults, beneath even the initiatory traditions that Rome found threatening, in spaces that were never temples, and never shrines in any formal sense, in the private rooms and sealed basements, where individuals and small groups practiced something that the ancient world itself distinguished from religion, something it called by a different name entirely, and something that the eruption preserved in evidence so specific and so disturbing that excavators occasionally chose simply not to record what they found. We are going into the dark rooms now. In 1875, excavators working through a house in the southern quarter of Pompeii, known today as the Casa del Chitarrista, broke through a wall into a sealed room in the building's lower level. The room had not been accessed since the eruption. The volcanic material that had filled it had been undisturbed for nearly 18 centuries, preserving its contents in the condition of the moment of burial, with the same indifferent thoroughness that the eruption applied to everything it consumed. The excavation director's field notes from that day describe the room's contents in terms that grow progressively more uncomfortable as the entry continues. Ritual objects, botanical materials in a state of partial preservation, small figurines arranged in deliberate configurations on a low stone shelf, a lead tablet with incised text rolled and pierced with an iron nail. The notes break off. The following day's entry moves to a different section of the building without explanation, Several objects from this room do not appear in the excavation's official catalogue. A junior excavator named Paolo Scafolio kept a private diary, discovered in a Neapolitan archive in 1953, in which he recorded what his director had chosen not to, that the room appeared to be as a purpose-built space for magical practice, that the objects within it represented a specialist assembled toolkit rather than a household's accumulated religious material, and that the lead tablets, incised text, which Scafolio could partially read, named specific individuals and requested specific harms be visited upon them in language that matched exactly the formulaic structure of the curse tradition that Roman legal codes classified as criminal magic. The room was not recorded. The tablet disappeared from the excavation's possession within a week. The room's existence entered the scholarly record only through Scafolio's diary, which means it entered the scholarly record as a footnote, as contested evidence, as the kind of thing that serious classical archaeology has historically found easier to set aside than to incorporate into its interpretive frameworks. But the Casa del Chitarrista was not an anomaly. It was one point in a pattern that runs through Pompeii's excavated spaces with a consistency that the evidence, taken in aggregate, makes very difficult to dismiss. The Defixio, the Roman curse tablet, is one of antiquity's most thoroughly documented magical practices. Thousands survive from across the Roman world, recovered from the wells, graves, springs, and thresholds where they were deposited, their lead surfaces incised with names and requests, and the formulaic language of binding and harm that characterized a tradition practiced across every social level of Roman society, from Britain to Egypt. Pompeii's contribution to this corpus is significant both in number and in the specificity of what the tablets reveal about the texture of magical practice in a single city. The Pompeian tablets cover the full range of concerns that brought Romans to magical specialists or drove them to practice curse ritual themselves. Commercial competition generated a substantial number. A merchant binding a rival's business, a tradesman cursing the customers of a competitor, a baker requesting that a neighboring bakery's ovens fail, its bread spoil, its owner suffer the specific misfortunes that would redirect commercial traffic toward the tablet's depositor. Legal disputes produced another significant category. Individuals facing court proceedings cursing the witnesses against them, the judges presiding over their cases, the advocates arguing on the opposing side, requesting that tongues be bound, that memories fail, that the capacity for effective testimony be stripped from those whose words might cause harm. One tablet, recovered from a well shaft near the Forum, names 7 individuals in succession, in each name followed by a specific requested harm calibrated to that person's role in what appears to have been a commercial dispute of some complexity. The first name is accompanied by a request that the named man's hands fail him, the hands of someone whose work required manual skill, a craftsman or artisan whose livelihood depended on the physical competence that the tablet's depositor wished to destroy. The second name requests that the named person's tongue be bound in any legal proceeding. The third requests sleep deprivation, so severe that the target cannot conduct business. The remaining 4 names are accompanied by variants on these themes, each specific enough to suggest that the tablet's creator had intimate knowledge of each target's particular vulnerabilities. This was not generalized malice. This was a precision instrument, constructed by someone who understood both the formulaic requirements of effective curse practice and the specific pressure points of each individual they wished to harm. Erotic binding constitutes perhaps the largest single category of Pompeian magical evidence, tablets and figurines and assemblages directed toward the compulsion or retention of desired individuals, requesting that a named person be unable to sleep, eat, or find peace until they turn their attention toward the tablet's depositor, that their desire be inflamed, their resistance dissolved, their existing relationships disrupted. The language of these tablets is often startling in its specificity and its intensity, naming body parts, naming acts. You're requesting interventions in the intimate physical lives of their targets, with a directness that reflects how completely the boundary between religious petition and magical operation had dissolved in the daily practice of ordinary Pompeians. Among the erotic binding material, a group of figurines recovered from a deposit near the Stabian Baths in the 19th century represent some of the most technically accomplished magical objects found anywhere in the Roman world. Each figurine is formed from two materials twisted together, lead for the body of the binding itself, and a secondary organic material, partially preserved, that analysis has identified as including human hair. The hair of the target, incorporated physically into the object designed to bind them, was standard practice in binding magic across the ancient Mediterranean world, reflecting a theory of sympathetic connection between person and material that held that what was done to a physical part of a person was done to the person themselves. To bind the figure was to bind the person. To pierce the figure was to afflict the person. The figurines from the Stabian deposit are pierced at the head, the heart, and the hands, the seat of thought, the seat of feeling, and the instruments of action, by small iron pins that have partially survived the corrosion of centuries. The deposit in which these figurines were found had been placed in a ceramic vessel, sealed with a lead cap, and buried at a depth that required deliberate excavation of the ground rather than casual concealment. Someone had dug a hole and placed a sealed container of carefully prepared magical objects at the bottom of it, refilled the hole, and left the deposit in place. The location, near a public bath complex used daily by hundreds of Pompeians, was chosen in accordance with the logic of magical deposit sites, places of high human traffic, where the energy of passing lives would activate and sustain the binding, where the boundary between the public world and the underworld forces invoked in the curse was considered particularly permeable. What the tablets reveal collectively is not a marginal or exotic practice, but something woven into the everyday problem-solving of a Roman city. When a Pompeian faced a business rival, a hostile witness, an indifferent beloved, an enemy who seemed to operate beyond the reach of conventional social redress, the curse tablet was a tool available through a network of specialists and accessible through knowledge that circulated widely enough to be self-administered by those who knew the forms. The deposits found at Pompeii's crossroad shrines, the small sacred spaces at street intersections dedicated to the Lares Compitalis, the protective spirits of the neighborhood, include tablet fragments and ritual deposits consistent with curse practice alongside conventional votive offerings, suggesting that the same shrine serves simultaneously as a space for orthodox protective ritual and for the deposit of material intended to cause harm. The specialist practitioners of Pompeii's magical economy operated in a space that Roman law defined with considerable anxiety and considerable imprecision. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code, that had included provisions against harmful magic. Later legislation under the Lex Cornelia de Sicarius Veneficis, the law concerning assassins and poisoners, which included magical practitioners under the category of venefici, those who used prepared substances to harm, attempted to distinguish between acceptable religious practice, tolerable folk remedy, and criminal magical operation. This distinction proved impossible to enforce with consistency because the categories overlapped at every point. A woman who prepared an herbal remedy for a sick child, using the same botanical knowledge she used to prepare a binding mixture for an unfaithful husband, was practicing medicine and magic simultaneously from the same body of knowledge. The law's attempt to draw a line through this continuum created a category of criminal practice that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, practiced openly under the name of religion and privately under no name at all. The house, identified tentatively by researchers as belonging to a professional magical practitioner, stands in the Reggio 7, its owner unidentifiable by name but legible through the extraordinary concentration of material found within its walls. Over 100 amber amulets of varying types and sizes, each amber piece either carved with a specific symbol or left in its natural form for the protective properties the ancient world attributed to amber across multiple traditions. A set of bronze surgical instruments that had been modified for purposes that had nothing to do with surgery. Their cutting edges dulled, their surfaces inscribed with symbols, their forms transformed from medical tools into ritual implements through a process of deliberate remaking that required both knowledge of their original function and knowledge of what they were being converted into. The modification of the surgical instruments deserves more than passing attention because it speaks directly to the kind of knowledge this practitioner carried. Roman surgical instruments were expensive, precisely made, available only through specialist manufacture. Obtaining them required either medical connections or considerable financial resources. The decision to acquire them and then deliberately repurpose them, dulling the edges that made them medically useful, inscribing them with symbolic content that transformed their identity from instruments of healing to instruments of ritual, reflects a specific magical theory about the power of transformed objects, about the accumulation of symbolic charge through the combination of an object's original function and its new dedicated purpose. A blade that had once cut flesh, now consecrated to a different kind of cutting, carried both histories simultaneously in the theory of sympathetic magic that underpinned this practice. In this house's back room, sealed with a wooden door, whose carbonized remains were found still in the doorframe, a collection of botanical material that subsequent analysis identified across multiple examinations. Dried seeds and plant matter from species including mandrake, henbane, and datura, plants whose pharmacological properties produce, in appropriate preparation and dosage, states ranging from mild alteration of consciousness to vivid hallucination to death. Plants that appear consistently in ancient magical and medical literature as ingredients and preparations designed to alter the state of the person who consumed them, or in some preparations, to be burned and inhaled rather than ingested. Alongside the botanical material, a set of small clay figures in the binding posture, limbs twisted behind the body, the characteristic position of the defixio figurine that represented the target of magical compulsion, physically restrained, their agency over their own body symbolically removed. The mandrake root in particular carried an elaborate mythology across the ancient world that reflected the genuine pharmacological power of the plant. Its forked root, resembling a human body, had made it the archetypal ingredient in preparations intended to affect the human form and its alkaloid compounds. Atropine, scopolamine, hyoscyamine produced effects that ancient practitioners would have recognized as the literal manifestation of the plant's magical properties: hallucination, altered consciousness, the dissolution of the boundary between ordinary waking experience and states that felt, to the person experiencing them, indistinguishable from contact with another realm of reality. Whether these plants were used in Pompeii's magical practice as ingredients in preparations given to clients, in ritual fumigations conducted in the sealed rooms where ceremonies took place, or in preparations that the practitioners themselves used to facilitate their own access to altered states in which magical work was conducted, the collection in that sealed back room represents a pharmaceutical arsenal of considerable sophistication. These objects were not devotional items. They were not the material of a worshipper maintaining a relationship with a divine patron. They were tools, assembled and stored by someone who used them in the provision of services to clients whose needs the city's official religious institutions did not and could not address. In the Regio 6, in a house whose formal rooms show the decorative investment of a moderately prosperous Pompeian commercial family, a basement space presents a different kind of evidence. The room has no windows. Its single entrance is through a trapdoor from the room above. Its walls show soot patterns from torches mounted at the height of an adult's hand, spaced at intervals suggesting that multiple torch positions were used simultaneously to illuminate the entire space. The floor deposit, the accumulated material of the room's use history, sealed beneath the volcanic layer, contains ash from repeated burning, animal bone fragments from species that do not appear in the food, remains of the house's kitchen area, ceramic fragments from vessel types associated specifically with libation and offering rather than domestic use, and a concentration of small lamps of a specific type that ancient written sources associate repeatedly with nocturnal ritual directed toward chthonic powers, toward the deities and forces of the underworld whose operations were most accessible in darkness. This basement was not a storage room. It was not a kitchen or a workshop or a sleeping space. It was built and used as a ritual space, accessible only through a trapdoor lit by torches and small lamps, used repeatedly over what the depth and composition of the floor deposit suggests was a period of years for ceremonies that left behind the material signatures of nighttime chthonic practice. The animal bone assemblage from this basement room merits specific attention. The species represented, black-feathered birds, a dog, specific cuts from animals that do not appear in the household's ordinary food refuse, correspond with precise consistency to the categories of sacrifice described in ancient sources as appropriate to chthonic ritual, to rites directed toward the powers of the underworld rather than the Olympian gods of Roman state religion. Chthonic sacrifice followed different rules from Olympian sacrifice, where the gods of the upper world received their offerings burned upward on raised altars. The powers of the underworld received offerings directed downward, into pits, into wells, into earth, into the darkness that was their domain. The basement itself, beneath the level of the living house, was already a chthonic space by the logic of this ritual geography. Ceremonies conducted there were conducted as close to the underworld as the architecture of an urban house permitted. The nocturnal timing of these rites was not incidental. Darkness was not merely practical cover for activities that required concealment. It was theologically necessary. The underworld powers were most present and most accessible at night, when the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was considered thinnest, when the ordinary categories that structured daytime reality loosened their grip, and the forces that operated in the spaces between those categories could be reached by those who knew how to reach them. The people who descended through that trapdoor and conducted their ceremonies in the light of torches and small clay lamps were not simply hiding. They were creating the conditions that their practice required. At Pompeii's crossroad shrines, the physical evidence of Hecate's presence accumulates into a picture of a goddess who is far more actively venerated in this city than the official record of Roman religion would suggest. Hecate, the goddess of crossroads and thresholds, of night and magic, and the spaces between worlds, occupied an officially ambiguous position in Roman religion. Too ancient and too widely venerated to suppress, too closely associated with the darkest forms of magical practice to fully embrace. Her triple form, facing three directions simultaneously, was appropriate to her position at the crossroads, where three roads meet, the liminal space that Roman magical practice identified as the point of maximum contact between the world of the living and the forces that operate beneath and beyond it. The crossroads in Roman magical thinking was not merely a physical intersection. It was a conceptual boundary point, a place where the categories that kept reality ordered and predictable became temporarily unstable, where what was normally kept separate, living and dead, human and divine, ordinary and transgressive, could briefly touch. Hecate presided over these points of instability. Her shrines at Pompeii's intersections were not simply decorative religious fixtures. They were maintained access points to the forces she governed, kept active through regular offerings and regular ritual attention, by practitioners who understood what the crossroads represented and what could be accomplished there by those who knew the proper forms. In 1931, excavators working in a house in the Reggio 8 uncovered a bronze figurine of Hecate, in her triple form, each of the three bodies intact, each carrying the torches and keys that are her characteristic attributes. The figurine was found not in a lararium or a shrine niche, but beneath the floor of a back room, wrapped in linen that had partially survived carbonization, surrounded by a deliberately arranged assemblage of objects that had been placed with the figurine before the floor above them was laid. This was not a casual deposit. It was a foundation assemblage, objects placed with deliberate intention beneath the fabric of the building, their concealment architectural rather than emergency, their burial planned rather than hasty. Around the Hecate figurine, a set of small lead figurines in binding positions, a collection of black pottery sherds from vessels that had been deliberately broken, a bundle of botanical material from species associated in ancient magical papyri, with Hecate specifically, and with nighttime operative magic, generally, and 3 inscribed lead strips, whose text, partially legible to the researchers who examined them, contains names and the formulaic language of compulsion directed toward those names. The breakage of the pottery vessels in this assemblage was not accidental damage. Deliberate breakage of ceramic objects was a recognized element of certain categories of magical practice in the ancient world. The destruction of the vessel's ordinary function, mirroring the desired destruction of the target's ordinary life, the shattering of form enacting symbolically the shattering of what the practitioner wished to dissolve. Whole objects could be restored. Broken objects, by the logic of sympathetic magic, could not be restored to their prior state any more than the conditions they were intended to destroy could be restored once the working took effect. The vessels had been broken as part of the ceremony that sealed the deposit. Their breakage was the ceremony's concluding act. Someone built this house above a collection of objects dedicated to the goddess of magic and the crossroads. Someone decided that what they were doing required concealment so thorough that it needed to be placed beneath the floor itself, beneath the architecture of daily life, invisible to anyone who did not know it was there. The building of the floor above was itself the final ritual gesture, the sealing of the working beneath the surface of the world, placed where the daily life of the household would pass over it, without knowing what lay beneath, where the weight of ordinary existence would press down on the magical intention below and hold it in place, active, sealed, permanent. Several of Pompeii's skeletal contexts have generated interpretive controversy that goes beyond the standard debates about eruption sequence and survival behavior. In a basement room of a house in the Reggio 1, excavators found a group of remains in a spatial configuration that does not correspond to what the physical evidence of the eruption's progression would predict for individuals sheltering from the volcanic fall. The individuals are not clustered near the walls or the door in the postures typical of those who died while sheltering. They are distributed through the room space in a configuration that several forensic analysts examining the evidence have described as deliberate, as a spatial arrangement that appears to reflect intention rather than the random distribution of people dying in place. Around these remains, ritual objects that were not the kind of personal possessions people typically carried when fleeing. The interpretation of this context remains contested. The evidence is incomplete. But what is not contested is that the room's contents, taken in their totality, do not tell the simple story of people dying in a volcanic disaster. The magical practice embedded in Pompeii's daily life was not secret in the sense of being unknown. Everyone in the city knew it existed. Everyone knew where to find someone who could prepare a tablet, assemble a ritual object, identify the appropriate deposit location, perform the ceremony that the situation required. What was secret was specific. The names of clients, the targets of particular operations, the contents of sealed rooms where the most sensitive work was conducted, in the precise nature of practices that Roman law defined as criminal and that therefore required the protection that concealment provided. The mountain preserved the concealment and the contents together indifferently, without distinguishing between what its buried city had intended to show the world and what it had intended to keep permanently hidden. Both are visible now and taken together. The tablets and the figurines and the sealed basements and the Hecate assemblage beneath the floor in the basement room where people arrange themselves in postures that the volcano alone cannot explain. They describe a city in which the boundary between religion and magic was not a boundary at all, in which the hunger for operative power over the circumstances of ordinary life drove Pompeii's inhabitants into practices that their official religious institutions never sanctioned and their legal system nominally prohibited. They did it anyway, behind locked doors and beneath floorboards and in basement rooms lit by torches in the hours when the city's respectable surface life had gone to sleep, in the careful modification of surgical instruments and the deliberate breaking of pottery and the pressing of human hair into lead figures pierced with iron pins, in the planting of botanical arsenals in sealed back rooms and the burial of bronze goddesses beneath the floors of ordinary houses on ordinary streets. The mountain found them there and kept them there until we came to look. Return to August 24th, 79 AD, not as prologue this time, but as consequence. The eruption did not begin with fire. It did not begin with the pyroclastic devastation that the word volcano now conjures in the modern imagination, the walls of superheated gas and ash moving faster than anything alive can outrun. It began at approximately 1 in the afternoon, with a sound that survivors who escaped described as a crack, a single percussive report from the mountain summit, followed by the appearance of a column rising into the Campanian sky with the shape of a Mediterranean stone pine, a trunk of dark material climbing vertically, then spreading at its upper limit into a canopy that blotted out the sun over the Bay of Naples and began, gently at first, to rain small pieces of pumice down onto the city below. For several hours, it was survivable. The pumice that fell in the eruption's early phase was lightweight, porous, the size of a walnut or smaller. It accumulated on rooftops and in streets and in the open spaces of courtyards, but it did not kill immediately. It gave time. Most of Pompeii's 11,000 inhabitants used that time. They gathered what they could carry, and they moved toward the city's gates, and they joined the streams of people pressing south and west, away from the mountain, away from the darkening sky, away from the deepening accumulation of material that was already making the streets difficult to navigate. Many escaped. The population of Pompeii on the morning of the August 24th was somewhere between 11,000 and 20,000, if the influx of visitors and traders using the city's port connections is included. The number of bodies recovered across 2 centuries of excavation amounts to approximately 1,100. The arithmetic suggests that the majority of the city's inhabitants survived the eruption by leaving early enough. The approximately 1,100 who did not survive made choices, or had choices made for them by circumstance that kept them in the city past the point of survival. Some of those who stayed were physically unable to leave: the elderly, the very young, the sick, the enslaved, who could not move without their owner's permission, and whose owners had already gone. Some stayed to protect property, or to wait for family members who never arrived. Some stayed because the eruption's early phase, the relatively gentle pumice fall of the first hours, did not look like what it was, did not announce itself as the beginning of a catastrophe that would kill everyone remaining in the city before the following dawn. And some stayed because they were in the middle of something they were not willing or not able to abandon. The physical sequence of the eruption is now understood in detail that was not available to the people living through it. The pumice fall phase lasted approximately 18 hours, the material accumulating to a depth of nearly 3 meters in some parts of the city, its weight causing roofs to collapse, its depth making movement through the streets increasingly difficult and then impossible. At approximately 1 in the morning of August 25th, the eruption entered a new phase. The column that had been sustaining itself vertically for hours collapsed, and the material it had been carrying high into the atmosphere came down not as gentle pumice rain, but as a pyroclastic surge, a wave of superheated gas and ash and rock moving outward from the mountain at speeds of up to 300 kilometers per hour, a temperature sufficient to kill every living thing it contacted within seconds. There were 6 pyroclastic surges in the final hours of Pompeii. The 4th reached the city. By the time it arrived, the streets were already silent. The people who had remained were already dead, or already hidden in whatever shelter they had found. The surge moved through the city's streets and into its buildings and into its sealed rooms with complete indifference to what those rooms contained or what they had meant to the people who had used them. It sealed everything, every fresco, every ritual object, every tablet and figurine and botanical collection and bronze goddess buried beneath a floor, every body, in every posture, in every room, the volcanic material that followed the surge, building over hours and days into the 4-meter deposit that covered the city, completed the sealing, compressed it, made it permanent. Pompeii ceased to exist as a living city and became, without anyone intending this, the most extraordinarily preserved archaeological site in the world. Consider what the eruption's preservation did specifically to the cult evidence we have spent this night examining. The fresco cycle of the Villa of the Mysteries survived because the villa's walls were sufficiently robust to resist the surge's structural force, and because the volcanic deposit sealed the painted surfaces from the atmospheric exposure that destroys organic pigment over centuries. The deep Pompeian red that has made the frieze famous is not faded. It is as close to its original intensity as 2,000 years of sealed preservation can maintain. The figures are life-sized, and the sequence is complete, and the theological argument of the initiation is legible, because the mountain kept it exactly as the painters left it. The Temple of Isis complex survived in the condition that made it the most completely preserved Isis temple in the Roman world, because its construction, rebuilt only 17 years before the eruption, with the devotion-funded resources of Numerius Papidius Ampliatus, was recent and structurally sound. The sealed spaces of the Purgatorium, the hidden niches, the sacristy where objects of the daily liturgy were stored alongside objects that had no place in any official liturgy, all of it sealed in the moment of the eruption's passage, and held in that sealed condition until excavators reached it in 1765. Among the specific cult-related finds from the destruction layer, the Isis priest's path through the collapsing city is among the most extraordinary pieces of narrative evidence that any archaeological site has ever produced. His skeleton was not found in the temple. It was found on a street outside the temple complex, some distance from the entrance, in a location that places him moving away from the building in a direction that does not lead toward any of the city's gates. Around him, and in a trail leading back toward the temple, excavators found a sequence of sacred objects, ritual vessels, implements of the daily liturgy, objects whose presence outside the temple can only be explained by someone having carried them out. He was not fleeing. He was moving with purpose through a city that was already in the process of killing him, carrying objects he considered too important to leave behind, attempting to reach a destination that the eruption prevented him from reaching. His route is reconstructible from the distribution of objects along the path between the temple and where he fell. He made it perhaps 100 meters from the temple entrance before the surge reached him. What he was trying to save, and where he was trying to take it, we cannot determine with certainty, but the objects found along his path include items that belong to the inner ritual life of the Isis cult, rather than its public liturgy. Objects that an uninitiated person would not have recognized as sacred. Objects whose significance was visible only to those who had passed through the initiation that gave them access to the tradition's interior knowledge. He knew what he was carrying. He knew what it meant. And he considered it worth dying for, rather than leaving behind for the mountain to bury. In the ecclesiasterion of the Isis temple, the small assembly hall, where initiates gathered for ceremonies that the temple's public worship did not include, the remains of several individuals were found in the ash. They had not reached the street. Whether they had tried to leave and been overtaken, or whether they had remained in the assembly hall deliberately, the physical evidence does not allow us to determine, but the room in which they died was not a refuge chosen for its structural safety. It was the room where the inner community of the Isis cult conducted its private life. They died in their meeting room, surrounded by the material of their shared practice, in the place that had defined their community. The Villa of the Mysteries presents its own version of this evidence. In the wine cellar of the villa, a group of 18 individuals sheltered during the pumice-fall phase of the eruption and died in the final pyroclastic surge. This is not unusual. The wine cellar was a structurally sound underground space, and sheltering in cellars was a rational response to the pumice fall that many Pompeians attempted. What makes the Villa of the Mysteries group notable is the composition of the individuals within it, and the objects found in the ash around them. Among the 18 was an older woman whose skeletal context has been the subject of sustained forensic attention since her remains were first analysed in detail in the 1980s. The objects found in close association with her remains, specific ring types worn on particular fingers in combinations that appear in Dionysian cult iconography, a set of small bronze implements whose function is not domestic, an inscribed object whose text was partially recovered and includes language consistent with cult leadership formulae, have led several researchers to propose that she held a position of authority within the Dionysian mystery tradition that the Villa of the Mysteries housed. If this reading is correct, she was the cult's presiding figure, its initiating priestess, the woman responsible for conducting the ceremonies depicted in life-size paint on the walls of the room above the cellar where she died. The 17 people who died alongside her may have been initiates, dependents of the cult community, in-household members, or some combination of all three. They sheltered together in the space beneath the house that had defined their shared religious life, and they died together when the surge reached them. The sealed rooms that recur throughout Pompeii's excavated spaces, rooms barricaded or sealed before the eruption, not in response to it, present the most persistently debated category of cult-related evidence in the site's archaeological record. The sealing predates the volcanic event in enough documented cases to make coincidence an inadequate explanation. These were rooms closed for reasons that had nothing to do with the mountain. Their contents, in the cases where excavators found them intact, and speak consistently to the same conclusion, that the secrecy with which certain practices were maintained in Pompeii was so thoroughly internalized that it continued operating even as the city was dying around the people who observed it. The portions of Pompeii not yet excavated amount to approximately 1/3 of the total site. Systematic modern investigation under the ongoing excavation project that began in 2012 has already produced finds that have required significant revision of interpretations built on the excavations of previous centuries. New frescoes, new skeletal contexts, new assemblages of objects that expand rather than confirm the picture of Pompeian life that older scholarship constructed. What those unexcavated sections contain, what sealed rooms and hidden deposits and buried assemblages remain beneath the volcanic material in the city's northern and eastern quarters, is genuinely unknown. The Naples Archaeological Museum holds in restricted storage a collection of objects from Pompeii that have never been publicly exhibited and have never been fully published in the scholarly literature. The collection includes material removed from the site across multiple excavation campaigns and assessed at the time of removal as too sensitive, too ambiguous, or too disturbing in its implications for the standard narrative of Roman religious practice to be incorporated into the public presentation of the site. Some of these objects have been examined by researchers working under specific institutional permissions. Their reports, where they exist in published form, could describe material consistent with the categories of practice this investigation has traced. Magical assemblages, ritual objects from mystery cult contexts, items whose function is legible only within the operational logic of practices that official Roman religion never sanctioned. What Pompeii's buried secret life reveals, taken in its full accumulated weight, is something that the standard account of Roman religion has always struggled to accommodate, that the gap between what a society officially believes and what its members actually practice in the privacy of their own homes, their own sealed rooms, their own nighttime ceremonies, can be vast and deep and thoroughly organized. Rome's official religion was a system of civic management as much as a system of spiritual meaning, and it served that civic function well for the people whose lives were adequately addressed by civic management, for the people whose lives were not. The former slaves who rebuilt a goddess's temple because she had given them what Roman society withheld, the women who found in mystery initiation the religious authority that the state's priesthoods denied them, the individuals who carried their private sorrows and private rivalries and private desires to practitioners who could address them through means that official institutions never offered. The official religion was insufficient, and they found what they needed in the spaces that the official record was not designed to see. The mountain saw all of it. The mountain kept all of it. And the mountain, in the end, is why we know. Not because the eruption was merciful. It was not. It killed everyone who remained, and it buried a living city, and it ended 11,000 individual lives, whose continuation would have mattered far more than any archaeology those lives might have left behind. The preservation is the consequence of catastrophe, not its compensation. But the catastrophe did preserve it. The locked door on that southern street, the room behind it, the people inside it conducting the ceremony that the city's public life never acknowledged. All of it sealed in the moment that the surge reached them, held in the volcanic deposit for 19 centuries, returned to us incomplete and fragmentary, and profoundly irreducibly human. They were not criminals. They were not degenerates. They were people reaching past what they were permitted to know toward what they needed to understand, in using the tools and the traditions and the practices that their world made available to them, doing in their locked rooms and their sealed basements and their mystery temples what human beings have always done, searching for meaning in a world that official explanations never fully account for. The mountain stopped their hands. It could not stop their evidence. And their evidence, read carefully, tells us something that no official record of ancient Rome was ever designed to tell. that the hunger for direct encounter with the sacred, for operative power over the circumstances of life, for initiation into knowledge that transforms rather than merely informs, runs beneath every society's surface with the same persistence and the same depth as the geological forces that move beneath the ground we build our cities on. Pompeii is not a monument to Roman civilization's grandeur. It is a monument to human complexity, to the locked door and the torchlight behind it, and the people gathered in the room that the city's official life never acknowledged, doing what they believed needed to be done in the hours before the mountain finally spoke. The door is open now. You have seen what was behind it. The mountain made sure of that.